Welcome back to our free React course, and this is another lesson about React props. This is the second lesson in our React props chapter, and in this lesson we are going to talk about which props can I pass. So which props can I pass to a DOM element, which props can I pass to my own React component, which props can I pass to a third-party component. We're going to talk about different ways where you can determine which props you can pass. We're going to talk a little bit also about TypeScript, and we are going to start by a few examples of passing props. So a few examples. The first example is passing props to DOM elements. So in this example, we are passing props to, in a React component, we are creating an image and we are passing props to that image. Now, a good way to examine this code and see how it works live is to go to the Academeez site. And in the Academeez site, you have a full article about this lesson and a step-by-step guide of everything we are talking about in this lesson. And in this article, you have a live IDE where you can see the code example, and you can also edit the code, and you can actually see and experiment how to pass the props. So this is a great way for you to learn React and learn how to use props. And in fact, if you like Academeez, you like our free content, Academeez is always free. It's MIT license, it's open source. If you feel sick about all those Medium articles of clickbaits, React is dead, front end is dead, and you want open source content based on community feedback, based on experts. So feel free to start Academeez. This will gain us traction and make the project move forward. Instead of the clickbaits, let's replace it with professional content. So make sure to visit Academeez, click the GitHub link, and you can press the star to start our repository, and it will be really helpful. So back to the article, back to the lesson, we are talking about passing props. For example, passing props to a DOM element. In the following example, we are passing props to an image. And as we mentioned in the Academy site, you have those example, passing props to DOM element, and then here you have an image, and you can have a props, and you can actually play with the props. For example, I can go to the editor and change this to 100, and I'll see on the right that the image grows. So passing props to a DOM element. A second example of passing props that we mentioned in the previous lesson is passing props to a React component that you created. So in here, I'm creating a child component. That child component on the bottom is getting props, and then the props is getting a name and an age, and the parent is passing that name and age. So as you see, props are remind us of HTML attributes, right? So the name of the prop and then the value. If you have a value that is different than string, for example, a number, or any other type that is different than string, you have to wrap it in curly braces, and this is how the parent is passing the name prop and the age prop to the child. Another example of passing props is passing props to a React component, but this time you did not create that React component. Rather, it's a third-party component. Like from this example, we are using MUI. So I'm importing a component from the MUI material, which is a very popular component library. Contains different material design components like button, like text field, like checkboxes. And those have designs and looks good. So I'm importing one of their component, a button component, and then I can pass different props to that component from a third library. The question is, how do I know which props I can pass? Which props can I pass to the material button? Which props I can pass to the image DOM element, which props I can pass here. So in this lesson, this is what we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss which props, how do I know which props I can pass to a DOM element, to my own React component, to a third-party component. So we're going to focus on how to know which props I can pass. We're going to describe the general rules of passing props to a child. So the general rules are, first of all, you have to pass the right props. This is what we're going to cover in this lesson. You need to know what are the props that I can pass to this component, to this DOM element, and you have to pass the right props to that component or DOM element. The second thing you need to make sure that you're doing right is passing the right type for a prop. So if a component is expecting a prop, but is expecting a prop of type string, obviously you cannot pass an object or a function. So if you have to pass the right type to that prop. The third rules, it's not a single rule, but a bunch of rules that we're going to cover in next lessons, is general syntax rules. For example, if the type is string, I don't have to wrap it in curly braces. For other types, I need to wrap it in curly braces. For example, spread operator to pass a bunch of props. Similar small syntax rules that we need to keep in mind. But this is the third rule regarding props. And in this lesson, we're going to focus on the first rule. The first rule is knowing which props I can pass or I need to pass, and knowing which props I can pass to a DOM element or which props I can pass to a React component. So we're going to focus on ways you can know which are the props that you need to pass to a component. So let's talk about how to know which props I can pass. And before we dig into something more specific, like which props I can pass to an image, which props I can pass to MUI, material design button, before we dive deep into specifics, let's talk from a high level about the theory, which props you can pass. So I like to demonstrate it with a diagram. So you're writing a component, a React component. And in that React component, you are writing how your component looks like. And you use a syntax that is very similar to HTML, but it's not exactly HTML. Let's say you have a component that returns an image. The syntax that you're using is called JSX. So it's JavaScript XML that you can use in JavaScript, but actually JavaScript doesn't support this syntax. If you try to write JavaScript with this syntax that we're using in a React component, you'll see a syntax exception. You see that JavaScript doesn't support this syntax, but what we're doing, we are kind of upgrading JavaScript to support this syntax. How do we do that? We use either a transpiler or a compiler. We use something that can convert advanced JavaScript to simple JavaScript. Advanced JavaScript that has this syntax supported, JSX syntax supported, we transpile or compile it to simple JavaScript. And this is how this syntax is supported. This syntax that is not supported in JavaScript, if we install a transpiler like Babel or a compiler like TypeScript, suddenly that syntax is supported. Now, what does this compiler or transpiler do when it stumbles on that syntax? What it does, it converts it to a React.create element. We call that a React element. So it converts it by calling a function instead of this syntax. So it's pretty simple, right? It stumbles on this syntax, it translates it to React create element. And what is a React create element? It's a simple object that collects the things that you want to create or run. It describes those things in a simple object. That simple object can go to a bunch of React internal engines and tools to know what they need to do to create a DOM element or to run a render of a component. So that React element is like a language that React understands, and then it can process to create the image that, in this example, the image DOM element. So a bunch of those, notice that the image that we created in this example, we are sending a bunch of props to that image. We're sending source and height and key and ref, and then the transpiler and compiler is translating that to a React create element, to a React element, and it is going to pass those props to the React element. So the object that is created here contains all the props that you specified in the JSX, an image in this example. Certain of those props are React internal props. This means that React is grabbing those props and is using those props in its internal tools like reconciler, like the render. For example, the key and the ref is something that does not belong to an image DOM element. Those are React internal props. React is going to grab them, and then after it grabs all those internal props, it will pass the rest of the props to an HTML image element. In this example, we're creating an image, so this is specific for this example. Otherwise, it can be a component where it can pass the rest of the props to a component, and this will receive the rest of the props. But the important thing to get from this diagram is that the props that you're sending, some of them can be React internal props, like key and ref. Those are props that are used by React. The rest are props that are used by either the component, if the JSX represents a component, or a DOM element, if the JSX represents a DOM element. So the image DOM elements will get the rest of the props. So basically the props that you can pass are React internal props, like key, like ref, plus the child props. Child props are the props that you can pass to an HTML image element or HTML div element or a certain React component or MUI button. So the component that you are using, those are all the props that you can pass. So again, the props that you can pass are the React internal plus the props of that component, and those represents all the props that you can pass to that component. Okay, so the part of React internal props, this is constant. This is something that React defines, and it's repeating among all child that you are writing in JSX, whether it's a DOM element or a React component. You can add to that component or a DOM element, you can add the React internal props. The second part, the child props, this is changing. This is changing if it's a DOM element of type image or a DOM element of type button, or an MUI third-party React component that gives you a button component. So this part, the child props, this is something that is changing. And this is what we're going to focus on this lecture. How do I determine the props that I can pass to the child? And this is very much depends on what kind of child we are talking about. If we're talking about a DOM element, if we're talking about our own React component, or if we're talking about a third-party component, like the example we saw with MUI button. So we'll start with a DOM element. So our first task is, what if our child props is of type of a DOM element? We saw an example of an image DOM element, and we'll use that example, but the same rules applies if we use different DOM element. So what are the properties, what are those props that I can pass if my child is a DOM element? And the properties that you can pass to a DOM element are actually the properties that are the props that you can pass are the properties that are defined in that DOM element. So every DOM element, rather in our example, it's an image DOM element or a button DOM element, every DOM element has an API of properties that it can get, events that it can get, certain exceptions that might be thrown from that DOM element. So we have an API for every DOM element. So the props that you can pass are the properties of the DOM element, not the HTML attributes. Okay, HTML is a different language, and the attribute, although they are often similar to the DOM element properties, but they are sometimes the same. It's a different language, and they're not correspond one-to-one. So HTML attribute, for example, HTML attribute of class, right? When you write an image, we can add an attribute of class in HTML, but actually DOM elements instances do not have a property of class. That class is actually mapped to a different property that is called className. So notice that the part that I wrote here, there is nothing that says here about HTML. So the props that you can pass if your child is a DOM element are the JavaScript properties that can be sent to that DOM element. Now, how do I know the properties that the DOM element can accept? Well, the source of truth of what properties I can pass to each DOM element is the documentation. And documentation is organized in a site called MDN, Mozilla Developer Network. And so this is where you check, this is your source of truth. This is where every DOM element instance is defined and the properties of the DOM element is defined. For example, if I go to MDN and I look for the image, right? We saw an example where we placed an image tag. So this is actually creating a DOM element that is of type HTML image element. And inside this documentation, I can see the instance properties. Now the instance properties, those are the properties as they are written here in camel case, right? HTML, for example, is often not camel case, it's kebab case HTML, but in here we are in the JavaScript world, so it's camel case, the properties are camel cased. So those are the properties that I can pass to that image JSX element. For example, alt, for example, we have here height that we saw we passed, and we saw that we passed also source. So those are properties that are defined here. Now some properties you can pass and you won't find it here. For example, you can pass style, but you won't find it here. Rather, you will find it in a lot of DOM elements are inheriting from, they have an inheritance chain where they inherit properties from another DOM element. So this image DOM element inherits properties from its parent HTML element. So you can see here you have additional properties that you can pass. And I don't think even the style will be here. Rather, it will probably be even further down the chain in the element. This also inherits, so you have also additional properties in the grandfather that it inherits from. And in here we'll probably find the style here. We'll find ID, for example. We find, let's search for style, for example. Maybe the style is not here. Maybe the style is in the parent. Let's search for style. No, probably in the parent, the style is here. I was mistaken. Here, the style is actually in the parent, not in the grandfather. But in any case, what you get is not only the properties of the image DOM element of the image, rather you get also properties from the inheritance chain, and those are additional properties that you can set. So how do you know which properties? Your source of truth, your number one tool is the documentation. The documentation will tell you which properties you can set, whether you're placing an image DOM element or a button DOM element. So if we're looking for a button, we can search for HTML button element and type MDN. And then the button example, we have instance properties of the button, as well it inherits properties from its parent HTML element. So we have the properties in here as well. So this is how you know the properties of DOM elements. Your source of truth is the documentation. So first way to determine which properties does a DOM element has is to view the MDN documentation. Another way we can know which properties we can pass to a DOM element is by examining what the IDE is suggesting and what TypeScript is suggesting. And this is, by the way, this is true for DOM elements as well as React component. You can use this technique to know which props you can pass to React components as well. And TypeScript is something that we highly recommend on using in React projects. So we'll have, during this course, we will also focus on developing React with TypeScript as well. And we'll state the differences in what you need to know to develop a React project with TypeScript. But it is highly recommended to use TypeScript for developing in React. And in this example, I have my IDE open, and I have two examples here. One that is marked in yellow for JavaScript. So this is a JavaScript file that has an image. This JavaScript file has an image, and we have another React project, but this time this is with TypeScript, and this is marked in blue. The header is blue. So remember, the header is yellow for JavaScript, the header is blue for TypeScript, just for us to understand the differences and what we're actually getting when we are using TypeScript to write our React project. So for example, if I view the image and we see that I'm passing here properties to the images, so I'm passing source and I'm passing class name. Notice that this is a difference between HTML and JSX. For example, in HTML, the equivalent of class name would be class. This is because, remember, the HTML does not refer to, although a lot of HTML attributes are the same name in the JavaScript HTML DOM element properties, some things are different. For example, in HTML, when you write class, it is mapped to a DOM element to a property called class name. Okay, because we usually in JavaScript, we do not use properties that the name of the properties are reserved word. So class in JavaScript is a reserved word. So usually we would not want to use that the name class as a property name. For as well, we use htmlFor. We use for in HTML and htmlFor in JSX. So this is something that we need to remember, that in JSX, the properties the props that we can pass to a DOM element are like the JavaScript properties. They are not like the HTML attributes. For example, class in HTML, in JSX, it's class name. Okay, so I'm in the JavaScript project now, and if I'm looking for an autocomplete, I don't get much information here. So if I'm opening the autocomplete box by typing Control plus space, I see only text suggestions that the IDE is giving me, maybe some code snippets below, but that's about it. So the autocomplete, what the IDE suggests me is really missing a lot of information. But if I go to the TypeScript and I go to the image and I do the same thing by typing Control Space to see the suggestions, and here I get a full list of all the props that I can pass to the image, in JSX. So that's really, it's really convenient. In JavaScript, you would have to go to the documentation of image and actually look at what you can pass from the documentation. With TypeScript, you get a full IDE support of everything you can pass to that image. So another way we can examine the properties that we can pass, those props that we can pass to a DOM element, in our case example, we're using the image DOM element, is that we can open the developer tools and we actually have a lot of information regarding properties of DOM elements inside the developer tools. To examine that, we have our code that we created with Create React App, and we'll talk about Create React App in future lessons. And here we have this image, and this image is an SVG, and we are activating our project using npm start, and then our project is now served in the browser in localhost 3000. This is the image. Now, if I'm opening the developer tools, I can examine the elements. Those represents the DOM elements, my DOM tree. So those represents the DOM elements that are created. And then here I can mark with this arrow here, I can point to the DOM element that I want to select, and I can select in the header the image. So now the image is selected. Now I have this DOM element, but how do I get the actual object of that DOM element? So once I select it in the elements, I can go to the console tab and I can type $0. $0 meaning the item that is currently selected in the elements, give me the actual object. And now we have a reference to the actual DOM element object. So if I do $0 I can actually see here all the properties. Pretty cool, huh? Pretty easy. So you don't have to go to the documentation. You have TypeScript, you have this, and you actually see a list of those DOM properties. And for example, I can do even source equals, let's find another image, puppies. So let's take copy image address. So now I can do source equals, oh, don't paste code in there that you don't know how to read. This could allow attackers to steer it like taking to. Please type allow pasting below and press enter to allow pasting. So allow pasting. Allow pasting. And now, okay, so I'll take this, sorry, I'll do source, and now I change the image to puppies. So you can actually not only see the properties that you get, you can actually play with it and assign new values to those properties and actually see those DOM elements change on screen. So this is another way you can actually examine DOM elements, grab their instance, grab the object, and see a list of the properties and understand what are the properties that you can pass to that DOM element. So I want to emphasize a common mistake that developers that are starting React are often doing, and I want to emphasize that props are not HTML attributes. And I want to give a few examples of what I mean by props are not HTML attributes. So first of all, what we talked about is class name. So if I'm in React world and I'm writing JSX, notice that to specify a CSS class, I'm using the class name. If I want to be if I was in HTML and I would want to write similar, I would do something like that, class and equals some class, right? Some CSS class. Okay, so notice that in HTML, this is marked as class. In JSX, this is marked as class name. So here's the difference between HTML and JSX. They mean the same. They mean to add a CSS class, but in JSX, this is called class name. And as we said, the reason for that is that the DOM elements do not have a property of class, because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Rather, the same property that corresponds to class in HTML, in JavaScript is called className. So this is why to specify CSS classes, we use in JSX className. Okay, notice that also I wrote a comment here, and the comment is also different from HTML, right? If I want to write a comment in HTML, I would do something like this, right? And write the comment in here. In JSX, if you want to write a comment, you open curly braces and then open a JavaScript comment. So remember, we're not exactly in HTML world, it's kind of similar, but we're in JavaScript world, and things often play different. Let's show another example. Let's say I'm writing a form. Okay, so I'm writing a form. So far, it's similar to HTML. I'm writing a form, and in the form, I have some kind of input. Yeah, let's say the input ID is an ID of email, and it's of type email. So what I often do in forms, you have something called label in forms, that the label describes the input. But to associate the label to the input in HTML, we would use something in the line of this label, and we will use for. Right? This is the equivalent of HTML. I'm using for. Notice that in JSX, for is turning to HTML4. Again, it's not common to set reserved words in JavaScript as properties. For is a reserved word, so therefore it's mapping to a different field in the DOM element of label. It is mapped to a property called HTML4. So in JSX, this is called HTML4. Notice also that we have here, we're in JavaScript, and the convention in JavaScript is to write variables, properties, to write them in camel case. Camel case is start with a low letter, and every word that I start is with a capital letter. In HTML, this is not the case. For example, HTML, if I want to add an event, for example, an onClick event, I would say onClick, right? So this would be mentioning an event in HTML. Or for example, if I want to add style in HTML, I would do something like this. Notice that this is not camel case. We are using often in HTML, we're using kebab case. Words are separated not by capital letter, words are separated by a colon. So the words are separated in kebab case, not a colon, sorry. So background color is here. But if I want to do the same in label, it's kind of look different. So I can do style, and I can set an object, but the background color will be camel cased. Same goes for events, right? So the events are not onClick like this. The event of the label will be onClick using camel case convention. So the C in click will be capitalized. Okay, so those are a few differences between HTML and JavaScript. Remember that HTML, you can have attributes like class. You can have in HTML attributes like for, but when you go to JavaScript, it's not so common to have reserved words as properties. So actually, the same class we have, it actually should be className because we're in the JavaScript world. The same for that we have are actually mapped to a property that is called HTML4. Remember that things are camel cased. So even if you write background color like this in HTML, in JavaScript, we're using background color and camel case. Events are camel cased as well. So notice that there are differences between JSX and HTML, and I wanted to emphasize those differences because there are common mistakes that developers think, oh, that syntax is very similar to HTML, but no, it has differences between this syntax and HTML. So we covered how to know which props you can pass when you're using a DOM element like image, like button. So number one is check the documentation. Number two, we use TypeScript and the IDE autocomplete to actually know which props we can pass. We saw it, which props we can pass to an image. And number three we had was checking the developer tools, grabbing the instance of the image that is created, and then from that instance I can just use the developer tools autocomplete to actually examine everything that the DOM element has. Now let's talk about which props you can pass to your own components. And this is quite, I think this is quite obvious. So if I'm using, I have a component, app.js, and let's say I'm creating a child.js component. Notice that we are now in JavaScript, not in TypeScript. So if I'm in creating a child JS component. And that component, let's say, gets some props. So let's say it gets a prop name, and let's say it's also getting a prop age, right? So it's getting two props, prop name and prop age. Obviously, the props that I can pass to a child are the props that this child expects to get, so name and age. So if now I'm using the child component, so going back to app.js and importing child from child, and I want to place this component, I need to pass name and age. And the properties might be required or might not be required. So usually if you use JavaScript, you're not necessarily going to get autocomplete. In the next lesson, we're going to show how to work with TypeScript, and we'll show how to define those props using TypeScript. So you have autocomplete and you have TypeScript check for the props, so it's really convenient to work. But if you're not working with TypeScript, so you don't have autocomplete regarding which props you can pass to this child. So what usually we're doing is we're adding a comment on the child in a JSDoc convention. So the JSDoc says certain selectors. For example, it gets a params of object, and then I can specify that what this object contained. Prop name and prop age are, prop name is of type string and prop age is of type number. I can also say that one of the props is not required, so I can say that the prop's name is string, but it's not. It can be string or undefined. So this prop is not really required. So now we have the name is required, the name is not required, it can also be undefined, the age is required. So this is a kind of comment that is called JSDocs, and it's supported, it has good support by the IDE, it has good support, and it's a common way to write comments. And when you write this comment, so you have a good support. If you hover over the child, you'll get a notification regarding, a pop-up regarding the props and what types and what they should be. So if I'm saying that the name, for example, is optional, I can say that my name has like a default, either props name or unknown. And then I can use here the name. Okay, so basically the child, if you define your own component, you need to pass the same props that the component expects. Now, if you're in JavaScript, you will need to understand your own component and understand which props you can pass. If you're working with other developers, it's better to place a comment regarding those props. If you're working with third-party library, that's a different story that we'll cover soon, but we're talking now about your own components. Your own components should get the props that they expect and the types of the props that they expect, and you write a comment to clarify what are the props and what are the types of the props. So we talked about DOM elements. How do I know which props to pass to DOM elements, and how do I know the props I need to pass to my own project, child components, or some other developer in my company that created a component? How do I know which props to pass to our own components? And now let's talk about how do I know which props to pass to third-party components. So one of the benefits of using React, React is the most popular front-end UI library, components library out there. So it has amazing ecosystems, a lot of libraries you can install and use, really simply just use them with a lot of stars and contributors and get a lot of very mature, if it's components or utilities that you can use in your React app. So we are going to try and play with a popular third-party library that is called MUI. Those are material design components. So I'll place the link in the description, and basically this is a library that you can install and you get a bunch of components. For example, you get nice looking buttons, and you get icons, and you get badge, and you get slider, a lot of cool things that you're getting from this library. So one of the things that if you're using a library, it's best to go over the documentation of that library. So if we want to install, we can go to the Getting Started installation to install the library. And in here, most of the library will get an installation command using your package manager. So if we're using npm as our package manager, the installation command is here. We can copy this. And now we're going to install this. So I'll open a terminal with view terminal. And then I'm going to paste this installation command. I can also install it in our JavaScript project, right? So we have a JavaScript project, and let's install it here as well. So we're using this library in JavaScript and in TypeScript just to know the difference. And we are going to try, after we installed it, we are going to try and use the button. So I'm going to delete everything here. Just leave our app really empty and really minimal. And I'm going to import the button from, too much T's, from MUI material button. And then I can just use this button and click me. And we can view this button by now running our app. And we should see the MUI button is displayed. So great, a nice looking button. It's not the regular HTML button. It has a cool ripple effect and it looks good. So this is the TypeScript. How do I know which props I can pass here to the button from MUI material? So your source of truth obviously is documentation. So you can go to the components, you can go to the button, and in here you'll see different example and explanation about each property that you can pass. You'll probably also have a link to the API, which is more robust. So those are examples, but you usually also have a link to the API, which summarizes all the props that you can pass. This is great. The documentation is a good source. If you're using TypeScript, so let's go back to our code, you'll get a good autocomplete. So if I'm opening the developer tools, I'll get all the properties that I can pass in this button. Now let's try to do the same in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, I'll import this and I'll go back to the app.js. I'll just remove everything like we did before, and I am going to import the button and also use the button. Great. So I'm going to run our app. I don't know if we installed it. So I'll run the app npm start. And I have this in my JavaScript. Let's do click me JS. So this is in the JavaScript. In the JavaScript, if I'm using a third-party library, I'm still going to get a good autocomplete of those libraries. The IDE plays nicely with the button declaration file. So if a library has TypeScript support and declaration file, so the IDE, even on JavaScript, will present a good autocomplete. In addition, you can control click or command click the button to see the props that the button has. So you can actually go and see the types of the button and go to button type map, I think. So each library, it's different here. So button own props. So those are props that are used only in the button, but there are more because there is certain inheritance in the button. So in here you also get good support, but in general, if you're using a third-party library, you have two resources. One is the documentation, and the second one is the IDE, using the autocomplete, seeing the properties, control or command clicking that component will lead you to a declaration file where you can see all the props of that component. So this is how you can tell which props you can send to a third-party library. Great, so we finished the second lessons about props, where we dug deep on how to understand which props you can pass. We talk about our first prop rules. We had 3 prop rules. Which props can I pass to a component, to a DOM element? The second rule is, what is the type of the props that I should pass? If the type of the prop is a string, I should pass a string. If it's a number, I should pass a number. We'll talk about the second rule, how to know which type of props I need to pass, in the next lesson. The third rule is different syntax rules, where we talk about the curly braces, the spread operator. We'll talk about TypeScript and how you define the props in TypeScript. So also in this lesson, we also talked about TypeScript, and I think we demonstrated some benefits that you have when working with TypeScript. So basically the props that you can pass to a component or DOM element is comprised of the React internal props, which is like ref or key, plus child props. Child props depends on what is the child. If the child is DOM element, then you can pass the DOM element properties. If the child is a React component, you can pass the props that the React component is expecting to get. For DOM element, our source of truth of which properties we can pass, which are the child props, is from the MDN documentation. And also you should remember that the props that you can pass to a DOM element are not identical to HTML attributes. So we saw that in the one of the props you can pass is class name. In HTML it's class, but in JSX the prop is called class name. For in JSX is called htmlFor. The reason is the properties, we're not using JavaScript reserved words as properties. We saw also that in HTML we're using for events lowercase, and in JavaScript everything is camel case. We saw also the style that we use background color or other styles in HTML that are separated by minus with the minus sign with kebab case, and in JavaScript they're separated with camel case. We highly recommend using TypeScript, right? So Academeez also is written in TypeScript. TypeScript is really cool in the, with the IDE support and autocomplete that you're getting, statics checks, and we'll continue talking throughout the course about TypeScript as well. So we're not just demonstrating JavaScript, we will also talk about TypeScript in certain lessons. Also, we talked about that we can use the developer tools to examine DOM elements, to see the properties of the DOM elements. For React component, we need to pass the props that the React component expects to get. We can know which props the component expects to get by TypeScript or by the IDE or by the documentation on that component. So yeah, everything we talked about in this lesson is available online at the Academy site. I'll place a link in the description. Everything is completely free. You don't have to register. It's open source, MIT license, so we don't want your email or your registration or your money. Everything is open source. What we would appreciate is your support on Academeez with a GitHub star. So our most valuable commodity is, well, YouTube likes are great, YouTube comments are great, YouTube shares are great, but the best thing you can do is start our GitHub repository, because it will gain traction, and this way we can actually spread the news that we have a site with open source content that strives for professional content and not for clickbaits like React is dead or front ends is dead. Everything is professional. The content is made by experienced developer, and also it's maintained by the community, so the community can open a discussion and remark and write their remarks about the content. So make sure to start us on GitHub, and that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next lesson.